Historians tell us that the first illustrated children's book, or at least the first we know about, is the catchily titled Orbis Sensualium Pictus by John Comenius. It was published in Latin and German in 1658. It isn't a storybook, it's more an encyclopedia with crudely executed woodcut illustrations. Even if it wasn't the first, all the children's books that followed throughout the 17th and 18th centuries mimicked the general format, and were similarly lacking in significant illustrative merit. There were alphabet and spelling books, riddles and nursery rhymes, but there were no illustrated stories published until John Newbery's The History of Little Goody Two-Shoes in 1765. This was really a novel with illustrations rather than a picture book, but it did set a precedent. The first real signs that illustration could do more than merely translate words are found in the early 1800s. In 1828, British cartoonist George Cruikshank published his illustrated version of the folk tales which had been collected by the Brothers Grimm a few years earlier. His illustrations were more technically accomplished than anything seen previously, but more importantly, they displayed a visual comic imagination which had been noticeable by its absence. Cruikshank went on to produce a comic alphabet book using the recently invented colour lithographic process, and compared to the safe and morally improving nature of what had gone before, the images were quite deliberately funny. In 1845, the book Strohel Peter by Heinrich Hoffmann was published in Germany, and this constituted a real landmark in the development of children's illustration. Like Cruikshank's alphabet, it used colour printing, and the 10 stories were far more pictorial than in earlier fiction. There is no attempt by Hoffmann to produce credible anatomy or posing. The illustrations are a series of very simplistic line drawings with flat colour applied in what can only be described as a modernist way. 20 years later, Max and Moritz by Wilhelm Busch was published. Like Strohel Peter, the book had a moralising and frequently cruel tone, but it was also very humorous and fanciful, and stylistically predicted comic art as much as it did the future of the picture book. Which brings us to Edward Lear, whose nonsense verses and doodle-like illustrations constitute a revolution in children's publishing, even if it would be another 70 years before its impact was felt. Unlike Hoffmann and Busch, Lear felt no obligation to moralise, opting instead for a playful silliness to keep his readers amused and their imaginations stimulated. He was an accomplished painter and wildlife artist, but he understood that children didn't see the world as adults did, and his deliberately wonky illustrations reflected this. Meanwhile, everyone else was determined to show how well they could draw. This was clearly evident in the illustrations produced by John Tenniel for the 2 Alice books. As with Lewis Carroll's writing, they were surreal and wildly imaginative, but it's clear Tenniel wanted his readers to believe in these impossible but precise and well-observed pictures. In the later stages of the 19th century, we enter what many consider a golden age of children's illustration, led by 3 very similar British illustrators. Randolph Caldicott's output was staunchly rural and backward-looking. It was exceptionally well evoked and anatomically correct, and his use of colour and line made for engrossing images for older children. It was a similar story with Kate Greenaway. Again, we see a nostalgic and innocent world evoked, and in Greenaway's case it was almost exclusively populated by female characters from a decidedly affluent background. Last of the 3 is Walter Crane. Stylistically, he was even more formal and precise than the others, but much of his output was more concerned with fairy stories, mythology and romantic history. The importance of these 3 can't be denied, but it's actually the torrent of illustration that came after that constitutes the real golden age. Around this time, remarkably sophisticated illustrations started to appear in America, led by Howard Pyle, Jessie Wilcox Smith, and most significantly Arthur Frost. He was a prolific illustrator whose work featured in over 90 books, but he's best remembered for the illustrations of the Uncle Remus stories by Joel Chandler Harris, first published in 1892. And the sophistication of his line drawing and plausible characterization made even Tenniel seem clumsy by comparison. The Wizard of Oz by Frank Baum, with illustrations by William Denslow, was published in America in 1900. Denslow's uncluttered graphic style and endearing characters, which owed a lot to the comic art of the day, graphically brought this modern fantasy story to life. But most illustrators concern themselves with more traditional fantasy. Arguably the most prolific and best regarded of these is Arthur Rackham. His astonishingly detailed pen and watercolour images have remained effective templates for how we see the world of goblins, fairies, princesses and dragons. And he was far from alone in what was becoming an overcrowded and talented marketplace. There were Edmund Dulac's equally convincing sensitive evocations of unknown lands and times gone by, and the painstakingly accurate and believable painting of Maxfield Parrish in America, and a nod in the direction of more modern geometric styling in the aesthetic approach of Danish illustrator Kay Nielsen. All of these were illustrators pure and simple, who either worked with authors or illustrated non-copyright folk tales, legends and myths. One of the earliest examples of the author and illustrator being one and the same is William Heath Robinson and his book The Adventures of Uncle Lubin. Published in 1902, the story and images display a disregard for reality and a whimsical humour combined with an adventure of epic proportions. Also published in 1902, Beatrix Potter's The Tale of Peter Rabbit was an immediate success. It was quickly followed up with a series of woodland tales illustrated with Potter's flair for animal anatomy and delicate watercolour technique. Due to lack of time, I've had to leave out many great illustrators from the Edwardian era, but I can't leave out Harry Rowntree, a New Zealander who came to Britain in 1900. His animal characters are among the best observed and comically posed ever seen, but this remarkable talent is generally overlooked in favour of others such as Potter and Rackham. And then there is the work of Ernest Shepard. Most famously, he illustrated the Winnie the Pooh books beginning in 1926. His approach is deceptively scribbly, but always completely descriptive and charming. His style had more in common with the Victorian and Edwardian illustrators than it did with his contemporaries, but that didn't seem to bother his young readers. The 20s and 30s saw the arrival of more radical modernist drawing styles. Now recognised as one of the real turning points in picture books, Millions of Cats by the relatively unknown von der Gogh was published in America in 1928. With its naive absurdist images and small amount of hand-drawn text, this is now seen as the prototype for the modern picture book. The story of Babar the Elephant by Jean de Bruynhoff was published in France in 1931 and a series soon followed. With Babar, the stylistic approach could not have been simpler, showing that outlines and block colours were all children needed. And graphic simplicity was becoming the norm, with large numbers of others in Europe and America joining in. Joyce Mercer was an English illustrator who embraced the discipline of Art Deco in her work with great success. And Esfir Slobodkina's 1940 book Caps for Sale emulated the folk art approach of von der Gogh, with the bonus of bright flat colour, another trend that persists to this day. Theodore Geisel, better known to us as Dr. Seuss, had his first success in 1937 with To Think It Happened on Mulberry Street. This book set the tone for all Seuss's work, using the same technique of overtly cartoon figures and large areas of primary colours, right up to and beyond 1957's The Cat in the Hat. In complete contrast to all this modernity, Thomas the Tank Engine by Reverend Wilbert Awdry made his debut in 1946. The series was extremely popular, in Britain at least, despite or maybe because it was so visually old-fashioned. And similar lasting success was achieved by the equally retrograde stories and images of the Noddy in Toyland series. Enid Blyton's creation first appeared in 1949 and was originally illustrated by Harmsen van der Beek, usually known as Beek. In 1955, the first Miffy story by Dutch author and illustrator Dick Brunner was published. This series was remarkably ahead of its time, using thick black lines and flat colour when few others had the courage. Many others would achieve later success by emulating this oddly inexpressive but effective technique. In 1963, Where the Wild Things Are by American Morris Sendak was published, and is now the best-selling picture book of all time. There was very little text and a relentlessly horizontal visual theme, and despite its undoubted modernity, the finely cross-hatched images were a stylistic nod to earlier times. Sendak's other big seller, In the Night Kitchen, had a more graphic approach and owed a debt to the comic style of Winsor McCay's Little Nemo. Tommy Ungerer published The Three Robbers in 1962, and this was an even more radical proposition than The Wild Things. It was much simpler, harking back to the work of Edward Lear, and Ungerer made great use of graphic visual variety with large areas of simply coloured background. This wasn't his only success in the children's market, and Ungerer also illustrated others with similar bravado and panache. A few years later, in 1969, Eric Carle's Very Hungry Caterpillar appeared. This was another groundbreaking book with holes eaten in the pages and a very arty, abstracted style, which challenged accepted wisdom about what children actually respond to. The Mr. Men stories by Roger Hargreaves first appeared in 1971. He had struggled to find a publisher for his unfashionably cheap and cheerful creation. But once they were published, kids couldn't get enough of them. Again, Hargreaves showed how ultimately children don't care about technique and are more interested in pictures which amuse and stimulate them regardless of technical merit. And if further proof was needed about children's attitudes to images, we need only look at the work of Jan Penkovsky. He's best known for illustrating the Meg and Mog series by Helen Nichol from 1975 onwards, and his outrageously simplistic images come closer to mimicking children's drawing than any previously seen. The Snowman by Raymond Briggs was published in Britain in 1978 and was revolutionary in two ways. Firstly, it was entirely wordless, so the narrative had to be understood from the images alone. And Briggs used the comic book and storyboard technique of multiple panels. No wonder the spin-off animation was so very successful. It was also in the late 70s that the association between Quentin Blake and author Roald Dahl began. Blake was by no means the first to illustrate Dahl's stories, but his scribbly pen and watercolour visuals have become inseparable from the stories for generations of readers. Which takes us pretty much to now, and it seems that when it comes to kids' illustration, anything goes. At one end there's the crude perspective-free images of Lucy Cousins' Maisie Mouse and Mo Willand's enormously successful Pigeon series, through to the more painterly Sendak-influenced images of Anthony Brown and the illustrations of Alex Schaffer for Julia Donaldson's Gruffalo. So we have to conclude there is no formula for success when it comes to illustrating for children. They like what they like, and the why of it will probably stay their little secret.